Hello everyone. My name is Thiago Allis. I'm in charge of the research group on tourism and mobilities at the University of São Paulo. We have this afternoon in studio Jaciel Kunz, our colleague from Federal University of Paraná. In Rio, we have João Freitas from Unirio. And from the United States, we have the great pleasure of having Mimi Schellerton this afternoon for a conversation on tourism and mobilities. This is part of an initiative we have here at the MobTur, which is our research group on tourism and mobilities, of mapping out the publications on tourism published at Mobilities, the journal Mobilities. And we wanted to start this conversation, the first video with Mimi Scheller, who was one of the founders of Mobilities, and of course she is one of the most important scholars on mobilities these days. Thank you so much for being with us, Mimi.
Thank you.
And to start this conversation, we wanted to learn a little bit about Mobilities, the journal. 2006, we are, approaching the 20th anniversary of Mobilities. We wanted to know how and why and under which circumstances this journal was conceived. And what's the role at that time and even today of mobilities and other kind of studies these days?
Okay, thanks. It's great to speak with you today. So we were, sorry, I'm still getting feedback on my end. Let me just pause there and say, if I'm talking, you can hear me okay? Okay, so it's clear on your side. Good. Okay. So I joined Lancaster University as a lecturer in 1999, and I started collaborating with John Arry, the late sociologist of mobilities and many other things, almost as soon as I got there. And I was working on my project on the Caribbean, which eventually became my book, Consuming the Caribbean, which was published in 2003. And he was working on his work on sociology beyond societies, and then other work on mobilities. And it was that convergence of an interest in the Caribbean region and all of the historical mobilities of this kind of colonial world and transatlantic world, with John's emphasis on a kind of European story of mobilities and the changing forms of mobility in a globalizing world, that brought us to this idea of creating the Center for Mobilities Research at Lancaster University. And in 2004, we held a conference called Alternative Mobility Futures. And at the same time, we were co-editing a book called Tourism Mobilities, Places to Play, Places in Play, which also came out in 2004. So from the very beginning of us thinking about mobilities research and the kinds of work we were doing, tourism was very much at the heart of it. And that book was a whole group of researchers at Lancaster who were faculty and graduate students and collaborators who were working on tourism mobilities. And it was after that conference and after those initial kind of interests and the forming of the center that we started to conceive of the journal. We said we need a journal for all of this work on mobilities. And John was also working with Kevin Hannum at that time and had been talking about a journal with Kevin. So the three of us came together and decided to launch the journal, Mobilities. And that would have been in 2005 because we had to prepare it and get it ready for the first issue, which came out then in 2006. So that was the origin story of the journal. Of course, it went on to, become a very important journal, kind of naming and defining this whole field of mobilities research.
Speaking of the book Tourism Mobilities, Places to Play, Places in Play, 2004, is completing 20 years in 2024. You and Uri explore tourism through the lens of mobilities. And how do you explain this concept, tourism mobilities? And why is it important for understanding contemporary tourism practices?
Well, so many of the research fields that were concerned with tourism at that time were very much about tourism as a business, or the economics of tourism, or maybe a little bit on the sociology and the inequalities of tourism. But what we were trying to do was to put tourism into this much wider lens of all different kinds of mobilities, of what we call the hosts and the guests, but also the transportation systems, the airports, the vehicles that were used, but the images, the consumer-oriented representation of tourism. Of course, John Uri had previously written his famous book with Scott Lash called Economies of Signs and Space. And in a way, this was building on some of the foundations of that interest in new economies and new ways in which digital and information economies were influencing businesses like tourism. But we got very interested in the idea of performance, which at that time, many people at Lancaster University were using this idea of performance and performativity to study tourism as a kind of production, as a kind of staged formation of space. And so we talked about that through this idea of places to play, which were the tourism destinations, and places in play describe the way in which place itself was a circulating mobile formation as different people converged, whether as visitors or as workers, capital investors of different kinds, and that tourist places themselves were kind of moving up and down on the scale of desirability and attraction, as well as problems. And what's amazing, when I was just looking at the contents just now, and I realized we had one chapter on the Olympics and the impact of hosting an Olympics event in Barcelona, which we could really think about 20 years later, what it's meant for Paris now. And there was a chapter on Hong Kong that talked about the impact of the SARS virus and how a place to play can quickly become a place of fear. And you know, those ideas are so current today, and it's really interesting to revisit those and to also think about the sort of virtual places to play that Jenny German-Moles talked about, and the construction of islands, like Matthias Junema's piece on the Palm Island in Dubai, and even things like nuclear tourism, which Kathleen Sullivan wrote about. So many things 20 years ago, which I think are very interesting to see how they've progressed since that time.
So nice meeting to hear you about this book. And all these publications on tourism and mobility is so good for us because we have a research field in Brazil that works on this idea of tourism mobilities. And now that the book marks its anniversary, it's so good to think about this relevance. It's interesting to reflect on how much has changed. So you often explore the effects of globalization on how we move around the world. And it's nice to hear you. How do you think globalization has transformed tourism practice over these 20 years? And what does this mean for how we understand tourism today?
I wrote an article for the journal Tourism Geographies this year, which had a special issue on tourism geopolitics. And I think that's one of the things that has really changed in the last 20 years, I would say. And I talk in the article about kinopolitics, the politics of movement, and geopolitics, and how they come together in this question of power and who is moving where and how, and who controls the systems of mobility. And as much as we sort of were diagnosing these issues 20 years ago, they've intensified even more so in terms of the geopolitical inequalities that are so prevalent in tourism, where you have a very wealthy kinetic elite and those also who come from countries who are able to have passports and visas and an expectation of travel, versus those who are, you know, the so-called hosts, the places that get traveled to, and those people who cannot travel, who cannot get tourist visas, who are not welcome in the tourist playscape. And so I think the inequalities have grown worse, and the geopolitical structures have changed, because we've seen, you know, the original field of tourism studies first noted the rise of tourism in the West, in the former colonizing powers, and they were often performing tourism in, you know, sites of colonialism or coloniality. And now, in the last 20 years, there's a much greater diversification of tourism, and the rise of, you know, tourists coming from Asia and moving, you know, from China to all different countries across the world. And there was the phenomenon of Japanese tourism, and there's the phenomenon of Brazilian tourism, and different periods of time have brought the sort of upswing in tourists as economies rise, and you have a growing middle class who are able to afford travel, and then new places come into play to cater to those travelers. But it's definitely changed the kind of the stage set on which tourism is performed, I would say. And of course, I think there's also been an increase in the risks and the fears, the sort of, you know, the fear of whether it's terrorism or viruses or plane crashes or, you know, all these different things, cruise ships stuck in ports, unable to leave, logistics disruptions. I think the sense of insecurity is greater than ever.
And of course, it brings us to the discussions and to the conceptualization of mobility justice. Of course, when you first came digitally online to São Paulo in 2017, I guess you remember, you gave a lecture or a keynote on theorizing mobility justice. This conference was published here in Brazil. And the same year, your book, Mobility Justice, came to light, which is, of course, a very important reference for any kind of, research and studies. How do you see this mobility justice in theoretical perspective after 20 something years of mobilities as a new domain of research? Meaning, mobility justice as a concept, how useful and how applicable is this today?
I think mobility justice was always inherent in the way I was thinking about mobilities, because of course we were always speaking about mobilities, immobilities, and moorings. And within that, we were thinking about inequalities and power. And it was, as I tried to sort of clarify that more and more, that the book Mobility Justice came into being as a statement of what was already informing the field that needed to be laid out. And I did it across different scales. So looking at those embodied interactions, which of course are very important within tourism, and I had already been writing about in Consuming the Caribbean. And then thinking about the transportation systems, the urban scale, the transnational scale of who could travel, who could be a tourist. So mobility justice helped me, I think, organize all of those different processes in my mind and talk about the power and inequality involved in each of them, each of the scales, which of course all co-occur, right, in the same moment. So if you think of tourism, it's both embodied and place-based and national and global all at once. And I think that's the important thing, is those processes are all happening there. and that there's multiple levels of inequality or injustice that are in play in that tourism encounter. So I also started to speak a bit of drawing on some concepts of Tim Cresswell's work to think about it as a constellation, a kinopolitical constellation where all of these different configurations of power were in play. And the tourism performance is a perfect example of how that happens. So mobility justice, I think, for me also was a marker of a kind of normative statement, like that as social scientists, we have a commitment to also uphold or advocate for those who are the most marginalized or have the least power, and reflectively thinking how we ourselves as academic researchers, we're engaged in a great deal of mobility, often in very privileged ways.
I was wondering on the importance or the centrality of commons or commoning in this discussion of mobility justice, because we are in a very capitalist world still, and of course there are some resistance, there is some movements against how the things are still organized in a very capitalist way, and the commons or commoning can come as a potential answer or alternative. So I'd like to hear a little bit more on how commons or commoning can be in the daily life, practice it in a way, and more specifically, how do you see this idea in tourism specifically? Do you have any examples or inspirations to share?
Okay, it's a very pertinent question for me right now, because I just returned from the U.S. Virgin Islands, where I was visiting the University of the Virgin Islands, which is in St. Thomas, which is a U.S. territory, formerly Danish colony, St. John, St. Croix, and St. Thomas. And what was very, very visible there was the lack of any kind of commoning and the extreme division between the private tourism sector, where hotels are owned, second homes are owned, beaches and yachts and ports, which you see in the Caribbean, and then a public realm, which was very, very lacking in investment. And so on St. Thomas, the roads were in very poor condition. The public transit system was very weak and depended on these kind of open air trucks where a sort of canopy and open benches had been put onto a truck bed, and it didn't even run to all of the island. And so what you saw there was an incredible overinvestment in elite tourism, and at its extreme, there are, the private islands of people like the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, that kind of tourism. And then the people and the conditions they're living in, which are lacking any kind of sense of collective future, collective direction. They're losing their young population, and many people are moving away to the mainland. And so the population that's left behind is aging, they're living alone, and they're very automobile dependent, but the automobiles themselves, the cars, are in very, very poor condition because the roadways are bad and there's no maintenance or repair facilities. And so you have very old cars that are being kept going. Now that was an extreme example, but you could say in many parts of the world, this is the case. Commoning would be the solution to that. Commoning would say, we actually need to look at mobilities as a commons, and we need to invest in provision of minimum accessibility and opportunities for different modalities of moving for as many people as possible so that they can meet a sort of minimum threshold. But we also need to cap the hyper energy consuming mobilities, carbon intensive mobilities of what I call the kinetic elite. So the idea of mobile commoning, you recognize that a street is not just a street and a vehicle is not just a way to get somewhere, but that it's a limited resource and that we need to share it more effectively. And instead of, we've privatized it and we've externalized all the impacts of our pollution, including our carbon pollution, onto others. And I'll add one more thing to that, is that in the Virgin Islands, on St. Croix, there was the largest oil refinery in the world was run by Hess Oil for the United States on St. Croix, and it left behind a lot of pollution and ongoing environmental impacts. And so that larger oil economy, which is supporting all of us in our mobilities in the United States, all our gasoline, so much of it was refined on St. Croix, and yet the Virgin Islands have a barely functioning transportation system.
So good to hear, Mimi. And we talk about mobility justice, we talk about fears, we talk about risk, and we have to talk about the COVID. And the COVID pandemic has disrupted global mobility, especially in tourism. And in your chapter, The End of Flying, you share some personal reflections on how the pandemic had changed the way we think about academic travel, and your personal travel also. And how did the experience of being grounded during that time impact your views on academic mobility? And looking ahead, how do you see the future of mobilities in this post-pandemic world?
Yeah, so I wrote a chapter on the pandemic and mobilities, in particular air mobilities, and reflecting on myself. And what happened during the pandemic is basically like everybody else, I stopped flying and took a breath and said, wow, I was really doing a lot of travel, too much travel. And I decided to account it, to do an accounting of it. And so I looked at all the trips I had taken, which was almost every month, like 11 or 12 times a year, I was flying somewhere. And they were all conferences I was going to, work trips. And I then aligned that with, okay, so it was a kind of productivity because it led to a lot of publications. And I looked at all the publications. But then I said, okay, quantitatively, I can look at my carbon footprint. I can look at my productivity as an academic. I can look at the international, accolades that go with it. But I could also look at the meaningful experiences. It brought the connections with people, the visiting and exchanging with other cultures. And so while I felt a sort of a guilt, I would say, about the carbon footprint, I also felt there were certain reasons why it's important to keep that kind of global exchange. National connections are an important part of academia and what we all do. So that article was reflecting on that. And ultimately, I came down on the side that young people in particular should still have that opportunity. And that for students who are learning about a field or a discipline and they're part of a global conversation, it's very important for them to make those connections with other scholars in other parts of the world. So from an academic perspective, I think universities should probably limit the amount of air travel that is used, and yet younger people should still be subsidized in a way to be able to travel. I mean, because it's still such an important experience. It's a formative experience in someone's life to make those connections. So I had really cut down on travel, and it's only really, it's 2024 now, and I only just started to travel again this year, moderately. And I just went on this first trip, and I got COVID, which I have right now.
How ironic.
Yeah.
Mimi, I remember when you were in São Paulo last year for the School of Mobilities, and there was a conversation with the students in this school in EASH, and I remember exactly this idea you shared with us, how we should push more students to travel. I mean, how important is, if you have to choose, and we need to choose, probably we should subsidize or give them more incentives to travel. And I think it's really important when you're talking about academic mobilities and programs to boost, students' mobility and give them a political sense on their mobility. It's not just being in a nice place, but what means being in a nice place, and being part of this amount of people who leave a footprint, but with a sense. And I think this idea is really interesting. If you shape better the distribution of resources between scholars, senior scholars, and then students. I like this idea. Thanks for emphasizing this again.
Yeah, and maybe that's a kind of commenting also. Like if we say each university has a certain travel budget in terms of the amount of travel they do, then they should make sure more of it goes to the younger folks who maybe haven't had the opportunity to travel. I mean, right now I'm the dean of the global school at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts, and we have a program of global travel for our students, and every student is given an opportunity to conduct a research project at one of our global project centers. And we have 50 project centers in about 32 different countries and domestically. Those students, they go for 7 weeks and they work in teams, they work full-time, and they get a very deep kind of immersion in the place they're visiting. So it's not tourism, although certainly they do engage in some tourism while they're traveling, but they have that lifelong impact of that 7-week research experience working for a local sponsor. And those projects, I think, are especially meaningful. Many of our students are first generation university students. Maybe they didn't even have a passport. They've never traveled outside of the United States. So I have no regrets about encouraging that kind of travel.
Professor, we'd like to learn more about the evolution of tourism studies within mobility perspective. In Brazil, mobility studies are often developed with a focus on tourism, particularly influenced by scholars like Thiago Allis and Bianca Medeiros. But when we look at the journal Mobilities, in a time frame of 18 years, more or less, we found 21 papers closely related to tourism. And if we compare with Brazil, here the proportion is more or less 15% of the articles on mobilities are products within a tourism focus. So we'd like to learn more about your perspective on the consolidation of this independent field, tourism, especially considering we are located in the so-called global south.
Yeah, I think MobTur, the Mobilities Tourism Group there, has done a really important. It's had a really important role in representing the consolidation of work on tourism mobilities, and has created a really strong center for that kind of research to happen there. And in the journal Mobilities, I was an co-editor for many years. I eventually stepped down a few years ago, but we take you know, the articles that are submitted to us, and they go through the review process. So the outcome of that number of articles is a reflection of how many were submitted on that topic, probably the percentage. And what I would just say about that is I think in the sort of journal publishing world, that many people who are writing about tourism are going to submit to specialist journals on tourism. So where there's some very good journals on, you know, tourism studies, on tourism geographies, and and they have their own kind of subfield within geography. For example, there's the tourism geographies group. And so they have not necessarily seen Mobilities, the journal, as the outlet for that body of work, which is interesting. And there's still the ongoing, more, you know, business-oriented journals that publish on tourism as well. There's work on sustainability and tourism, which is its own special niche. So I really think that your work in Brazil has been the ones to sort of carry the torch forward in a way for the field of tourism mobilities.
Thanks a lot.
Mimi, sorry, I have a very quick comment, because there has been a very important paper some years ago, or 10 years ago more or less, with a question: tourism mobilities is still a current issue. You remember this paper, right? And this has been asked more or less 10 years ago, and we are trying to somehow keep this question in mind to debate if tourism is still a current issue on mobilities studies. And your comments are really inspiring. Thanks for that.
Oh, absolutely current. And like I said, whether it's, you know, Olympic tourism, academic tourism, pandemics and tourism, we had a chapter in the book on favela tourism in Brazil in the original tourism mobilities book. All of these issues are still so current and important. And I think the changes that we've seen in this time period around borders and border securitization also make the study of tourism mobilities even more important today, when we have this division between citizens and those who are policed at the borders and who are excluded, and the questioning of belonging, and how tourism fits into that, how the freedom of movement is being undermined in the world today in so many ways, by whether it's physical walls or different kinds of digital tracking systems that we're all subject to. And I think in tourism, it's even more in your face, that there, you know, all those biometric systems that are now being used in airports, where you sort of have to look into a camera as you go through, or you can buy the special bypass, you can buy the global entry or the PSA pre-select, and these things. It's really made the tiering of mobilities, of who has privileged mobility and who is disprivileged, is very, very obvious in the world today. And I think to study it through tourism mobilities is really important.
I just checked the information. It was written by Tim Coles. That was the name of the author.
Oh, right.
Yeah, I just forgot for a moment, but I was checking here, and that's the full name of the paper. Tourism Mobilities is still a current issue in tourism. It was published exactly 10 years ago, August 2014. And
wow.
It's interesting that we are still discussing, and apparently it still makes sense, a lot of sense. To keep this discussion.
Apparently we need to check in every 10 years. Maybe we'll think about 2034, what's going to be happening then.
So, Thiago, we are wrapping up. We are about to finish.
I think so. So it's on you, right?
So, okay, I can do it. And maybe so. First, we have to thank you the time that you share with us today, and we truly appreciate the valuable contributions you've made to this important conversation. And it's also a pleasure to hear And to finish our conversation, what advice would you give to young researchers starting out in tourism mobilities? And as we're wrapping up, is there any final thought or message you'd like to share about the broader impact of tourism mobility on global society? It's just this simple, just a simple question.
A little question. Okay. Well, first, as far as the advice goes, I would say to remain curious. And I mean, one of the wonderful things about John Arry's work as a sociologist was that he inspired curiosity in so many people and so many students who followed his writing and his thinking, and found it like opened up new ways of looking at the world and experiencing the world, really, and thinking about it differently. And anything you do in academic work, I hope, leads you to that curiosity and that sense of investigation and what's happening here. Why is this happening? Why are things the way they are? How did they get this way? And maybe how can we change them if we don't like the way they are? So that's the advice part. As far as the future goes, I think social awareness that leads to social movement is really important. And there's an important connection between mobilities, the study of movement in a way, and social mobilization and social movements. And so to go back to the examples in the Caribbean, there's efforts underway all the time to hold on to public access to beaches, for example, beaches that get taken over by hotels when there's should be a defined right to public access to your shoreline of a coastline of an island. That's one kind of movement that happens. But also other kinds of mobilizations, sometimes for common land, for access to land that was held for generations without private title. And that's something people are challenging as tourism developments come in, especially after disasters. And I think that's a big issue as we see more and more natural disasters related to climate change. People are being displaced, and those who are able to afford to come back are often related to the tourism industry, and local existence is no longer possible. And so, for example, right now in Hawaii, in Maui, there's a real fight of the people of Lahaina that was burned down in that horrible, horrible fire to hold on to their town and their homes and their land, their culture. And I think those kinds of struggles are very much part of what when we study tourism, we need to study those movements as well.
Professor, taking advantage of this great opportunity, I would like to add a final question from me. We discussed a lot on mobility justice, and I would like to learn more about your opinion on tourism. Being straightforward, is tourism just a fair mobility or no? In general?
Oh, that's a trick question. I would refer you to Matilde Azcarate Cordoba's book, Stuck with Tourism, because as fair or unfair, as just or unjust as it might be, we are stuck with it. And I mean that both the people who are the tourists and the people who work within tourism economies. So many places are stuck with tourism because they're dependent on it economically. And so we can't erase it altogether. We can't say, let's stop tourism. But we certainly are seeing movements, for example, in Barcelona, where they threw water on the tourists, or in Venice, where they want to charge a fee for tourists to enter Venice, other places that are sort of rising up against tourism. So there's, I think, a debate to be had about what's the extent of tourism that's acceptable and how economically important is it? Can we diversify our economies? Can we make better linkages between local economies and tourist economies? And so I don't think it's ever going to go away altogether, but we can certainly make it better.
Thank you very much.
So Mimi, thank you so much for your time, for your enthusiasm, for being so kind with us. We are always in touch, and we like being in touch with you because you are always inspiring us and, you know, provoking us towards very good directions. It is interesting how you mentioned in the beginning of your answers that tourism was there at the beginning of the, you know, Center for Mobility Research discussions, and how tourism apparently can be a very good and important and dense topic to make mobility studies even more, even more interesting and even more relevant. So this is what we trust, and that's why we're here. And thank you so much for, you know, come with us in this, in this journey. Thank you so much. Hope to see you soon, either online or here in Brazil or in the US or someone else. And take care. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Thiago. And absolutely a pleasure to talk with you today.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.